So welcome everyone to our April 350 meeting on Zoom again. I think we've really had a remarkable year using this new technology and having some wonderful speakers. And so tonight is no exception. The agenda will be, we'll start out with our guest speaker, Dr. George Stone, and follow with some question and answer period, followed by some announcements of upcoming 350 events and other actions that you can take. No. And then we will be winding up at 8:30. At 8:30, so we won't run overtime. And I want to.
And if I might, after Dr. Stone's presentation, we will have a question and answer period. And so if you would use the mechanisms to raise your hand, and that's under reactions for most down in the lower section, lower center section, and it allows you to raise your hand. And when you do that, it puts you on the stack in order, and then I will call upon you. Is that okay with everybody?
All right. So let me begin by introducing our speaker for the evening. Dr. George Stone is a professor emeritus of natural sciences. He worked at MATC for a number of years, and he has been a participant in international global warming conferences and is considered an expert on this issue of climate change and global warming. And we're really lucky to have him as an active participant in our local 350 Milwaukee group. And he's a tremendous resource for us and for the community and the area at large. So tonight, Dr. Stone is going to be putting some, having his annual, actually, 2021 State of the Planet address, which he's been doing the last few years for 350 Milwaukee, and we look forward to that every spring. And tonight he'll have a special emphasis on the decreasing biodiversity and the rising extinction issue on this planet, which has great implications for all of us. And so I would like to have Dr. Stone take over at this point. George?
I'm honored to be here. I've been a member of 350.org for quite some time, and it's a great group, and it's an extremely important cause, as you know. I don't have to sell you on that. I've been interested particularly in the loss of biodiversity and extinctions in recent years, and so I'm going to focus in on that primarily. And my title, I hope, isn't too intimidating. I try to have an intimidating title. So anthropogenic extinctions portend planetary biocide. Little alliteration I hope you appreciate in there as well. But it's a very heavy subject. Anthropogenic, of course, means human caused, as is the climate change, the global warming we're experiencing. Anthropogenic extinctions are due not only to global warming, although in a major way now it's getting to be more and more, and we're very concerned about the insect world. But anthropogenic, of course, is human caused. Planetary biocide. I gave this paper, the core of it, a year and a half ago at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in Phoenix. And I think that's my next slide. This is the slide that the title slide I used last a year and a half ago, September 2019, at the Geological Society meeting. And it's somewhat longer. And of course, the paper today is much more up to date. I have included a lot of more recent research the last year or two. Little bragging here, it was at this meeting of the Geological Society that I was elevated to the status of fellow of the Geological Society. And here I am shaking hands with the president at that time, Don Siegel. And I was cited, quote, and I'll read this, as one of the strongest voices in the geoscience community in raising the awareness of global warming. So I'm very proud of this, and that's why I'm bragging about it. Next slide, please. Here's the doomsday clock, in case you didn't recognize it. It's just before midnight. Next, please.
Whoop.
This is from the doomsday clock statement of this year, which was issued on January 27th. I made up the little title there, "For Whom the Clock Ticks." Atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations hit a record high in 2020, one of the 2 warmest years on record. You're probably well aware of that. The massive wildfires and catastrophic cyclones of 2020 are illustrations of the major devastation that will only increase if governments do not significantly and quickly amplify their efforts to bring greenhouse gas emissions essentially to zero. Next, we have another paragraph there. Now, in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the members of the Science and Security Board therefore set the doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight. What is that? A minute and 40 seconds. The closest it has ever been to civilization ending apocalypse, and the same time we set last year in 2020. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has reset the doomsday clock. We're in the greatest danger since this started right after World War II. Next, please. Let's do a quick reality check. Anthropogenic climate changes and their impacts are real and are increasing. Next. The principal causes are increasing greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, but also methane, Eugene. Most of this CO2 derives from the combustion of fossil fuels. And final point, effective mitigation of future impacts. Effective mitigation of future impacts requires major reductions in the combustion of fossil fuels. Simple as that, and as complex and complicated as that. Next, please. Just a quick review. Since we started using fossil fuels, it's been a dramatic increase, of course, over the decades and the centuries. Next. That was energy use. Here's the rise of fossil fuel derived carbon dioxide. Next. Similar rise in the CO2 in the atmosphere. Latest measurement I heard of from the lab on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, it was 417 parts. Wow. Next, please. Here's the temperature, global mean surface temperature. Next, please. Here's the result, the fires in California, incredible. I don't want to say incredible, just frightening. Next, please. Now we have the pandemic. When the world finally emerges from the worst pandemic in a century, everyone will rightly celebrate. It might be tempting to mark the COVID-19 experience as a one-off, a dismal anomaly to be forgotten. But the pandemic is not a unique departure from a secure reality. Next. It is a harbinger, an unmistakable signal that much worse will come if leaders and institutions do not enact wide-ranging reforms to forestall and minimize future pandemics, to restore, and this I put in white for emphasis, to restore the primacy of science-based policies, and to reduce the possibility of nuclear war and the impacts of climate change, to say the least. These are the major considerations in the Doomsday Clock statement. Next, please. And here's the close of the Doomsday Clock portion of this presentation. Next, please. Biodiversity is our main interest in this talk. Biodiversity is decreasing dramatically, and including many extinctions. Next, please. This is a report just released by the United Nations Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. IPBE acronym looks easy, but it's a long. The title of this report, Nature's Dangerous Decline is Unprecedented. Nature's dangerous decline is unprecedented. Species extinction rates are accelerating. Now, this is 2 years old, this report. The main points in bullet form here: current global response is insufficient. Transformative changes, and that word transformative means a lot. It's a heavy duty word. Transformative changes are needed to restore and protect nature. Next, please. Opposition from vested interests can be overcome, to take an optimistic view, for public good. Next. Most comprehensive assessment of its kind is this report. Over 1 million species are threatened with extinction. Oh, well, we can understand what that number means now that we're approaching 600,000 deaths from COVID, most of them unnecessary. Next, please. This is continuing with this United Nations report. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating, with grave impacts on people around the world now likely. Next, please. The overwhelming evidence of this report of the IPBES global assessment from a wide range of different fields of knowledge presents an ominous picture, said IPBES Chair Sir Robert Watson. The health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend. The health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide.
Yeah, very scary.
Next, please. The report finds that around 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, many within decades, more than ever before in human history. Next, please. Now, this is an IPCC special report on global warming, comparing global warming of 1.5 degrees C, which is what we're striving to limit ourselves to, versus a full 2 degrees Celsius. And there are big differences in the impacts. Climate models project robust differences in regional climate characteristics between present day and global warming 0.5 degrees C and between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. These differences, and this is a summary of the impact, these differences include increases in mean temperature in most land and ocean regions, high confidence for that prediction, hot extremes in most inhabited regions, high confidence, heavy precipitation in several regions, medium confidence, and the probability of drought and precipitation deficits in some regions, medium confidence. Sea level will continue to rise well beyond the year 2100, high confidence. Is there any more on this one?
No.
Next one, same report. On land, impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, including species loss and extinction, are projected to be lower at 1.5 degrees C of global warming compared to 2 degrees. Well, no surprise there. Next. Limiting global warming to 1.5 compared to 2 is projected to reduce increases in ocean temperature, as well as associated increases in ocean acidity and decreases in ocean oxygen levels. Well, it increases in ocean acidity because of the increased dissolving or solution of carbon dioxide. Next, please. Consequently, limiting global warming to 1.5 C, which is what we're trying to do, is projected to reduce risks to marine biodiversity, fisheries, and ecosystems. High confidence. And final, climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth are projected to increase with global warming of 1.5 degrees C and increase further, again, no surprise, with 2 degrees Celsius average temperature increase. Next slide, please. Mark Urban. The current global temperature rise of about 1 degree or a little more than 1 degree, and we're trying to hold it below 1.5, has shifted species up the mountains. The species that require a certain low temperature As the warming of the atmosphere continues, they have to move higher in the mountains to maintain their habitat. One example of this that I'm very familiar with is the pika, which is a little rabbit-related timberline rodent out in the Rocky Mountains, and they're in danger of extinction. Shifts species up higher latitudes as well because of temperature requirements, has altered the timing of key life events such as flowering and migration, and eradicated populations and species. As the climate continues to change, these impacts on biodiversity are expected to accelerate. Next slide, please. A large fraction of both terrestrial and freshwater species faces increased extinction risk under projected climate change in the 21st century. As emphasized by Mark Urban, who we met in the previous slide, we are now reaching a threshold for the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Next. Extinction risks from climate change are expected not only to increase, but to accelerate for every degree rise in global temperatures. Lauren Cousineau warns climate change will be responsible for the mass extinction of species. Mark Urban agrees. We urgently need to adopt strategies that limit further climate change if we are to avoid an acceleration of global extinction. Next slide, please. Here's the geologic timescale going back. The top part here is 500 million years. You see, during that, that's known as the time when life really developed and flourished. And there have been 5 major episodes of mass extinction produced by natural causes, either in primarily temperature or chemistry of the local environments. But in any case, we are now in the midst of the 6th great extinction in geologic time. And it's anthropogenic. We're causing it. We're causing it. Next slide, please. Here's a great book by Elizabeth Colbert. It was published in 2014. And she really called attention with a lot of evidence from many different approaches to this 6th great extinction. Marvelous achievement. Next slide, please. And here's some comments by Elizabeth Colbert. Over the last 500 million years, there have been 5 mass extinctions when the diversity of life on Earth suddenly and dramatically contracted. Scientists are currently monitoring the 6th extinction, predicted to be the most devastating extinction event since the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. Next. Wow. Professor Colbert shows that the 6th extinction is like, by the way, she's a professor at Texas Tech University. Professor Colbert shows that the 6th extinction is likely to be mankind's most lasting legacy, compelling us to rethink the fundamental question of what it means to be human, of course, in the context of the Earth's ecosystems, in the context of sharing the planet with millions of species. I mean, what is our responsibility? Mm-hmm. What should be our ethics regarding nature? We seem always to be preoccupied with ourselves. Next, please. Thank you, Elizabeth Colbert. Here's some well-known extinct animals. The Tasmanian wolf. Here's a great auk from the North Atlantic. And of course, the Galapagos, some of the Galapagos tortoises. Poor George passed away a couple of years ago. And here's the famous dodo bird. Here, this is the greatest mass extinction I think that we know of in the modern part of the Earth's history, and that's the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeons used to inhabit virtually all the nesting trees in the upper Midwest and much of the Northeast. Go back 200 years. And I think it was Audubon, John James Audubon, who was down somewhere like in northern Kentucky during the time of the passenger pigeons' annual migration. And he said it darkened the sky from horizon to horizon for the entire day. That's how many birds there were. And by 1914, the last bird was died in the Cincinnati Zoo. It's unimaginable. The market hunters. I never ordered squab myself, but these are some of the animals which have gone extinct. Next slide, please. Here's some recent research highlights. Just go down the list here, please, Greg. Research in this general field. Biodiversity, of course, is enormous. It should be, and it's generating more and more interest all the time. So stay tuned. Next slide, please. This is a kind of out of focus picture, but it shows significant percentages from just a seventh down here of birds, those the only dinosaurs that survived, but then with a quarter and a third and 40%. Major losses. Next slide, please. Planetary biocide. That was in the title of this presentation. The most effective counter strategy is direct and clear presentation of science, but the paramount imperative is that citizens be advocates of reason.
There you go.
Next. We must address our planetary climate crisis now before it becomes irreversible and threatens not only exacerbation of Earth's sixth great extinction, but the eventual end of life as we know it on Earth. Planetary biocide. Next, please. Think about that. Now, ecocide. In a recent term proposed. I proposed biocide at the GSA meeting September 2019 in my paper there that I mentioned, but this is 2021 ecocide. International lawyers, environmentalists, and a growing number of world leaders, including the Pope, say ecocide, widespread destruction of the environment, would serve as a moral red line for the planet. Next. Pope Francis describes ecocide as, quote, the massive contamination of air, land, and water, or any action capable of producing an ecological disaster. The pontiff has also endorsed a campaign by environmental activists and legal scholars to make ecocide, or ecocide if you prefer, the fifth crime before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That would enable violators to be prosecuted and held accountable. Next, please. Stewardship of planet Earth. That's what we've got. More than 70 medical and public health organizations recently issued a call to action on climate change. This was June 25th, 2 years ago, calling it the greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. A little bit different way to look at climate change. The greatest public health challenge of the 21st century. Perhaps a very important way to look at it. Next, please. Let this be a call to action, not just for health professionals, scientists, educators, and scholars, but for all who recognize and respect the unique humanizing value of objective intellectual enterprise and its effective communication. Knowledge is indeed power. It is what distinguishes our species and endows us with the stewardship of planet Earth. Next, please. James Hansen, who testified before Congress in the summer of 1988 and warned Congress that the global warming crisis was coming and that we should start preparing for it. Well, this is 2016, just a few years ago. The relevant scientific community, in our opinion, has been exercising self-censorship in its warning to the public about the danger of human-made climate change. Yeah, he has criticized his fellow scientists for their reticence. Well, I wasn't reticent. Next, please. It would be difficult to overstate the threat. It would be difficult to overstate the threat of increasing human-made climate change, which we suggest threatens to bring about some of the greatest injustices in the history of the planet, of current adult generations, that's us, to young people and future generations, and of people of the industrialized North to people of the South, as climate change is due mainly to emissions from nations at middle and high latitudes. Next, please. In other words, we've got an extra responsibility.
Yes.
A cost of doing business. Well, I mean, that's the fossil fuel business, isn't it? The energy business. Who's liable for these industrial byproducts, so often euphemistically dismissed as externalities? By industrial byproducts, of course, we mean the impacts of global warming. Next, please. It is a cost of doing business. The fossil carbon business. According to present practice, the financial burden is borne by the victims themselves and or by the public at large through taxes and higher insurance premiums. Next, please. Victim liability. Now that's a strange concept. Victim liability. The concept of victim liability is contrary to fundamental ethical principles of fairness and justice. Some might say, however, it's endemic to capitalism. The party that is responsible for the damage is liable for the damages. What an outrageous concept. The party that is responsible for the damage is liable for the damages, not the victims. That's the way it is now. Next, please. Failure to assess such liability amounts to a de facto subsidy of the damaging activity and serves as an incentive for its continuation. For crying out loud. Next, please. I have always asserted this concept most strongly and believe in it totally. Next, please. This is from a paper I gave at the GSA 11 years ago. An informed, rational, and responsible citizenry is essential to the survival of democracy. This foundation of free society is being undermined by a pervasive propaganda campaign to discredit scholarship and reason and to elevate uninformed opinion and partisan parroting to a level of equal validity and credibility in public discourse. Next. When public policy is substantially influenced by, or indeed predicated upon, myth, suspicion, denial, and demagoguery, then we are in danger of traveling backward in time from the age of reason into the shadowy abyss of the intellectual dark ages. Next. And those of us who stand aloof, eschewing advocacy to view professional responsibility only through the narrow prism of our own research, are enablers of and responsible for this deplorable retrogression of rationality that can, as history abundantly demonstrates, lead to the decline and collapse of civilizations. And I'm proud to say this was in my paper 11 years ago. Next slide, please. Long before I ever heard of that. Well, wasn't before I heard of Donald Trump, because I lived in Manhattan for 4 years, in New York City for 4 years in the late 70s. And even then, Donald Trump's name around New York City was mud. He was known as a crooked businessman who didn't pay his contracts or his workers, as a womanizer, as a racist. He was prosecuted a number of times for discrimination in housing. And of course, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times demanding that the Central Park five young black men who had been found innocent, that they be executed. I mean, this guy, there's no excuse. We knew all about this guy 40 some years ago. Anyway, excuse me, I don't want to get too political. Hey, pull aside the wizard's curtain. Why did that make me think of Donald Trump? The most effective strategy is direct and clear presentation of science, observations and measurements and their rational interpretation in the context of nature. Can't say it any more simply than that. An important second step is pulling aside the wizard's curtain to expose the myths, misrepresentations, and motives of agenda-driven deniers and contrarians. Next. But the paramount imperative, as I said before, is that we be advocates of reason. not just geoscientists or scientists or educators or scholars, I think I repeated this slide, but all who recognize and respect the unique humanizing value of objective intellectual enterprise and its communication. Yeah, I repeated this slide, but I can see why. It's really a good slide. Knowledge is indeed power. It is what distinguishes our species and endows us with the stewardship of planet Earth. Next. I love this quote, and I use it in talk after talk. It's from two earth scientists, two geologists. A fundamental principle of a civilized society is to protect people from harm done by others. If we are to call ourselves a civilized species, there is nothing for it but to change the way we produce and consume energy. Who said this? Next, please. David Archer and Stefan Rahmstorf. David Archer is a distinguished scientist at the University of Chicago. Stefan Rahmstorf is over in Potsdam in Germany, a distinguished oceanographer. And this is from their book, The Climate Crisis. I love this quote. It's absolutely right. I find it inspiring. Next, please. Notable characterizations of extinction. I thought I'd finish up with this so we could have a better idea of what we're thinking about. Paul Ehrlich. I think one sign that you're getting old, and I am, is that you're always telling stories. No, when I joined the faculty at the University of Oklahoma in the fall of 1964, in 1965, that next year, they completed a new high-rise building right next to the geology building. It was the botany and microbiology building. And they had a big dedication ceremony. And Paul Ehrlich was the speaker at the dedication. Very, very distinguished microbiologist. Quote, in pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it perches.
Ah, good.
Next. And these are in alphabetical order. Stephen Jay Gould, one of my heroes, unfortunately a Red Sox fan. Life is a copiously branching bush, continuously pruned by the grim reaper of extinction, not a ladder of predictable progress. Take heed. Now, I don't know Guy McPherson, but he said, the money to be made is clearly more important than the extinctions we cause, including our own. I'm afraid he may be right. Carl Sagan, of course, we all know. Extinction is the rule. Survival is the exception.
Oh.
Next, please. David Suzuki up in Canada. Toronto, our planet has not seen an extinction crisis as serious as the one in progress for 65 million years. Next. E.O. Wilson, most famous Harvard biologist. The extinctions ongoing worldwide promise to be at least as great as the mass extinction that occurred, typo, at the end of the age of dinosaurs. Well, we need to lighten up. In case you don't recognize them, a couple of dodos resurrected.
You say hello, I say goodbye.
And finally, the last slide.
Oh, okay.
So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, if there's anybody still there. Shall we entertain some questions or comments?
Where is?
Yes.
I was on mute, excuse me.
One of your-
Oh, mea culpa, mea culpa. But please raise your hand either
Everybody.
in the lower section under reactions or on your participant list. It can allow you to raise your hand, but let's do it that way electronically. And we'd like to all do that. It's hard for me to keep up with 25 hands. So Eugene, if you would, use the digital manner. Everybody with that?
Good.
Okay, I did see you first, Eugene. Eugene, go ahead. And then we have Dennis.
precise.
Eugene?
Yes, one of your displays said mankind again. We have women in Congress who are some of the biggest deniers. Can we please always be saying humankind? Forget about mankind. There are women destroying this planet. Please. And the other point that I've been making for years, as you know, is the methane problem. And the more I read about it, the more it becomes a bigger problem. Because as we have global warming and the oceans are warming, the lakes are warming, the tundra is warming, more and more methane is being released faster and faster. Everything I read about it. I think, even though some people are saying that the predictions are too high, I think the predictions are too low. Just look at the methane problem. I still don't think enough people are studying it. Just
Okay,
look at
thank
the
you,
Russians,
Eugene. You have to be shorter.
bringing their ships through the Arctic Ocean now. Why? It's methane.
Well, that's an important point, Gene, and I'm glad you made it, Eugene. Of course, much of the northern hemisphere, where the most of the land is under the taiga, the great northern forest, and the tundra. And tundra covers just an enormous amount of territory across Canada and, of course, Siberia. And that tundra is comprised of vegetation. Much of those tundra plants are not doing very well under the higher temperatures. The climate change is forcing them out of their survivable environment, and they're dying. Now, when that organic matter dies, if it dies in the presence of oxygen, then it produces carbon dioxide, the decomposing gases, and that, of course, is a big greenhouse gas. But if it dies in the absence of oxygen or low oxygen, it produces methane, which is an even stronger greenhouse gas. And so with the immense amount of tundra that we have around the northern hemisphere that is going inevitably to melt and thaw out, and it's going to produce an enormous amount of greenhouse gases. And I agree with you, Eugene. We don't know quite how bad that's going to be.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Eugene. We have Dennis, then Greg on the stack. Go ahead, Dennis.
Thank you, George, for another great presentation. A question, I'm sure you have some answers to this, but two parts actually. How well are we doing it at keeping at 1.5? And if it goes from 1.5 to 2, would that be a linear increase, or would it start to get exponential if we started going from 1.5 to 2?
First, I think it would be exponential. There are very few linear processes in nature, and especially when we don't have any experience with them. But I think climate scientists are worried. I'll refer you to a new book that just came out by Michael Mann at Penn State. It's called The New Climate War. And he's right in the middle of all of it, and it gives a good, within the last year, perspective. But they're worried about that. And it's going to be a lot. That's why the UN report focused on that issue and predicts they're trying to scare people into a little more action. But yeah, that's a good point. We're not doing very well right now. I would say, if I were going to live that long and were a betting man, I'd bet on, we'll be lucky to hold it to 1.75 the way it looks right now.
Thank you, George. Thanks, Dennis. Greg Walter, then Joe. Go ahead, Greg.
Hey, George, again, thanks for the presentation. On maybe a slightly different note, something that I think of occasionally is I remember back in the 1970s when we sent the Voyagers out deep into space on each of those probes, because we knew that they would eventually end up, and they have since, or at least the Voyager 2, I believe, has gone into deep space and probably out of the universe. And we knew that they would end up there. We expected them to if they didn't run into any debris. We included golden records, at least they were golden plated, with a lot of information about the way that we saw the world at that time.
Right.
I'm curious if there is anyone on Earth today working on leaving behind a record of our current civilization in many places around the globe that might be found by intelligent life that reemerges on Earth maybe in 100 or 200 million years after our demise. I know that's kind of a speculative question, but I want to throw it out there and see if you've heard of anything like that.
Well, no, I haven't, but it's a great question. And most interesting, I'm sure there are those people. I mean, we had a lot of people who were very much interested in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and still are. And so, you know, I think that's a very worthy project. Let's look into that. You can come back. You're an excellent presenter, Dennis. You come back and give us a report on that. You know, the effort to leave the legacy of this human civilization, preserve the legacy.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Greg. Joe.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. Tell me, how well do you think we're doing with carbon sequestration, either natural, like planting trees, et cetera, or artificially, like pumping it underground, those kinds of things? And what do you feel about carbon fee and dividend schemes?
Let's see, I'm unmuted. Well, the carbon scheme, carbon fee and dividend schemes, as far as I know, originated primarily with Jim Hansen, the great climate scientist. That was what he proposed. And so I'm kind of sympathetic to that. Your other question was regarding, remind me?
Yeah, how well are we doing with carbon sequestration?
Yeah, well, fair.
Yeah.
I don't think much of carbon sequestration by pumping it back into the ground. You know, it's like I always used to use the analogy of a smoker. You know, and the smoker, he's got a bad cough. I'll make it a man, and he's always coughing and clearing his throat and so forth. And so he takes cough drops. And you know, he's never going to cure that with cough drops. You got to quit smoking. And we're not going to cure global warming with pumping gas back or oil and gas back down underground. We're going to have to stop using fossil fuels. And so I regard that as that whole subject as a distraction. Same way with engineering, you know, sending a lot of aluminum foil up into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight, and these other crazy schemes. That we know what the problem is. We should treat it directly, and we can make a lot of money for the business people doing that. Right now, as many of you know, we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. They can write off the expenses they have for exploring for additional oil and gas. You and I, Joe taxpayer, is paying for that. Why? And then they're ruining the planet. What is wrong with? Because they own our government. That's the basic and unfortunate answer. We got to change that. We've got to change that.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Joe. Next, we have Bill, then Charlie.
Hey, George, wondering if you have any thoughts about the Biden administration's approach to climate change. I know we don't know a lot about it yet, but do you see potential there?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And thanks everybody who's asked questions. Presenters are becoming more and more polite these years. You may have noticed. They very often thank every questioner for their question. That's a great question. I haven't heard anybody say that's a poor question. But anyway, this is very interesting. I so far so good. when Joe Biden appointed John Kerry as his principal climate advisor, I thought, yay, because I remember back in 2014, when Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama went to China and met with President Xi over there and persuaded him to stop withholding his support from the Paris climate meetings, because he had a tremendous influence with a lot of the third world countries. Well, he agreed to that, and he did withdraw his objections, and the Paris climate meeting was a big success. And I've had, John Kerry's had my confidence regarding climate since then. Well, I know Michael Mann personally because we've had him to Milwaukee, I think 4 times as a guest speaker, and very nice guy. And I asked him by email what his take was on John Kerry's appointments so far. And this was about a month or so ago. And he said, so far, from me, he gets an A. So that's pretty strong, because Michael Mann is no slouch, and he's been out on the political lines. And again, I recommend his book, The New Climate War. So that's my answer regarding Joe Biden. So far, so good.
Yeah. Well, can I jump in here a second? And thank you, George, and thank you, Bill. Later on, we'll be talking about our next meeting. And that next meeting, our steering committee decided to get a national update in terms of this administration. Gwen Moore, staff person who's in charge of climate, transportation, and other related areas, will be giving us an update on current legislation. Gwen has also asked to join because she's been appointed to the science committee. So I'm just putting that in there since it came up today right now, but that we'll talk about that a little bit later. Again, thanks, Bill. Thanks, George. Charlie. Charlie.
Yeah, George, sobering presentation as usual, but information we got to hear. I think John Kerry is doing a climate summit next week in Washington. That's a good thing. And then, of course, we have the UN conference in November. So I'm wondering if that is, you know, if you find that encouraging and hopeful. And then we've got Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion and all the young folks, you know, weighing in on all this. And I just wonder what you think about all that.
Oh, it's all great. Very, very positive things. And getting young people, especially with an inspiring young woman like Greta, that's so important, because it gives a certain legitimacy and credibility, or street cred, you might say, among young people to the subject. It doesn't mean you're some kind of egghead or bookworm, or to bring terms out of my past. But you know, it's wonderful. I see a lot. I'm quite optimistic, Charlie, and I see a lot of good things happening. And you know, Gina McCarthy, Biden appointed her as head of EPA, and she's excellent. And who's the other climate person he brought in? But I'm generally pleased. And on Biden, if anything, you know, Bernie beat up on him and knocked him a little farther left. So I'm happy about that. I think Biden's becoming wiser and more progressive with age.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Charlie. Next, we have Dennis, then Chris. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yes, George, I want to challenge you a little bit here on your statement that knowledge is power and so on. It seems like we have plenty of scientific knowledge about what's happening with extinction and climate change. And things don't seem to be getting much better. And I'm just wondering if, I mean, when we have a pretty high percentage of people in America that still think the planet is only 10,000 years old, I mean, we're talking about beliefs that are pretty deep. So
yeah, they all voted for Trump too.
Exactly. So maybe there's something about political change and Citizens United and all that that is at least as important, or maybe not important, than the knowledge of science.
So political change is going to require education, and
Yeah.
that's
We have plenty of knowledge.
That's it. That's why knowledge is power. I didn't say it's the only power. Money, of course, is the power that runs this country primarily and the world. Money makes the world go around, is what that was. But we're making progress. If we can continue to educate people, then we can take the power away from the money. I think I've got to be optimistic. But then there's
Right.
the old story about optimism and pessimism, which is a very brutal story. But some of the kids that I grew up with in school in Chicago, their families were Holocaust escapees. I mean, they left Germany in the late 30s, and made it to the United States. But one comment I never forget was that in Europe, the pessimists went to New York. The optimists went to Auschwitz.
Ooh.
I said it was brutal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But true.
Well, thank you, George. Thanks, Dennis. Next we have Chris and Greg. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George. I'm wondering, I'm as concerned about weather as I am about climate. The rains are too hard, you know. I'm afraid about all the plants being stamped out with you know, hail and stuff. So anyhow, in the 80s I saw probably a Nova talking about climate change way back then. They weren't talking about like they knew anything, except that it just seemed that with all the cutting down of trees that the weather was going to get crazier. Do you think planting a bunch of trees would help with the weather?
Planting a bunch of trees will help absorb more carbon dioxide, take it out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis. So planting trees and just growing green things which photosynthesize, that's a good idea, and that will help. But you know, climate change is the world's weather, so to speak, and that will reduce the frequency of severe weather. Now, you talk about the rain. One of the most important things that is happening is, of course, the largest heat storage, the heat sink on the planet is the oceans, and they're absorbing enormous amounts of heat because the heat transfer, the energy balance for the Earth is positive. It's absorbing more heat than it's radiating back into space. And one of the reasons is, of course, the greenhouse gases, which are helping to absorb more heat. But in any case, the oceans are warming up. And we have found out over the last 20 years that they're warming to significant depths, greater depths than we predicted. The sea surface temperatures, the SSTs, are getting way up there. The Gulf of Mexico is approaching 90 degrees at the surface in the summertime. And of course, the warmer the surface waters get, the more evaporation there is. And the more evaporation there is, the more moisture, the more humidity is in the atmosphere. And of course, that's the humidity that produces precipitation and also carries the energy that drives the weather. So because of the warming oceans, the weather is not, I wouldn't buy property down in Houston.
What about trees?
Trees, well, I said that was very important, to plant more trees. So that's a great strategy. Stop cutting them down. You know, that's what we need to do. But you know, it's an international problem. Most of the rainforest loss is not in the United States. It's where the equator crosses land. That's where the tropical rainforests are, and the rainforests are being cut down at an alarming rate, and not just in Brazil, but also in Central Africa and in Indonesia, Southwest Pacific.
Thanks, George. Thank you, Chris. Greg Walter.
It's Jan.
Actually,
Oh,
I have a
hello,
question.
Jan.
Thanks, George, for your talk. Do you think any of the effects that the pandemic has had on the atmosphere or what's going on now is going to influence positively people's attitudes, or is it going to change anything, or is it just people are just going to go back to doing whatever? I mean, do you think there's been any changes that have happened because of this pandemic? that are positive?
Well, I mean, they've made us more aware of the potential dangers of pandemics. You know, the last great one was back in 1918 after World War I. And, but whether or not the warming climate, the reduced and changed habitats and ecologies, ecosystems, whether that's going to make mutations of viruses more prevalent or more likely, there's a danger there. That we are wreaking ecological destruction, ecocide, the Pope calls it. And that we don't know what effects that's going to have on the evolution, the life cycles, or the multi-generational cycles of organisms like viruses. So maybe pandemics will become a much more frequent occurrence in the global warming world. I don't know. We don't know. But it's an important topic to investigate and a great question.
Thanks, George, and thank you, Jan, for your great question. Next, we have Tom Siri.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that point, I watched how the people who were affected most by hurricanes down south, how they voted in the last election. They voted like they don't believe that hurricanes are going to come anymore or something. So there needs to be some education down there.
Exactly.
Yeah. The second thing, just to mention, the whole issue that you bring up in your talk is product liability. And I don't know how many of you know Dean Muller. Dean Muller has started, Georgia knows about that. And just to let other people know, Georgia started a group to try to put pressure on our Attorney General, Josh Call, to start a lawsuit against the petroleum companies for the damage that they're doing to the environment and the climate in Wisconsin. So there's a group of us who are working on that to try to bring Josh Call along on that. I think he's going to be willing to come along, but he's going to have some tough times coming up. But I think that's one of the goals that we have to look toward. Product liability. Oh, lawyers love product liability and all that kind of fun language. Yeah, ooh, rub your heads together. But if we could get a decent settlement, it'd take years. But if we could get a good, interesting settlement on the oil companies, it could pay a lot for putting in solar power and other kinds of alternative energy in Wisconsin. And I think that certainly would be something very interesting to happen. So I think those are a couple of points to say. One last thing that has struck me is that in the 2018 report, the global temperature had gone up 0.88. At end of 19, it was 0.94. It was going up 1/10 of a degree. At the end of 2020, it has gone up to 1.04. So another half. I mean, it just keeps on going up. And I'm concerned how it's going to be over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, that it's going to keep going. So those are my concerns. And George, I appreciate your work on this. And we're going to get you talking to more people.
Well, Tom, thanks very much for your comments. I'm so glad that you brought up Dean Miller's group. They call themselves Wisconsin Environmental Justice, WEJ. Dean Muller is the chair of the committee or the organizer. It's really important going through the state attorney general. And I know that a number of people in this group are interested in the subject. It wouldn't be at this talk if you weren't. So if you're interested in joining Dean's group, using our legal system to try to put a stop to some of the fossil fuel practices, why, please get in touch. Again, Dean Miller, is it M-U-L-L-E-R, I think, Dean Miller. Wisconsin Environmental Justice is what they call themselves. Great to bring that up, Tom.
Thanks, George. Thank you, Tom. Dennis, I'm going to hold you. Terry's got a question. Go ahead, Terry.
No, it's Bruce.
I mean, Bruce, excuse me.
I didn't rename myself. I'm on Terry's computer, but I want to call everybody's attention to Drawdown. I did a presentation there at 350 several years ago, and George would like your comments. It's a lot more complicated than just stopping burning fossil fuels. There's got to be alternatives, and there's got to be a whole lot of other things going on. Project Drawdown talks about 100 different things that need to be done, and it's not just as simple as setting up wind farms and putting solar panels up. There's 100 different things, and they all need to be done. And so drawdown.org is a website that is continuing to do research, and I want to commend everybody to take a look at that website and understand what it's about. And George, I'm wondering if you've had any contact with Drawdown and some of the solutions that they're talking about there.
No, I haven't, Bruce. I regret to say. I appreciate you bringing this up. Of course, when I mention the principal causes, I don't mean to imply that there aren't a lot of other lesser and 100 different things to do. So the implication of that is not intended. But yeah, that's a very good group, Drawdown. I've heard of their work, and I recommend it.
Yeah, and it includes things like educating girls and family planning. Not just the question of fossil fuels, but lots of things need to be done. And I really encourage people when I give talks on Drawdown to pick something and go to work on it. There's just so many things that need to be done, and everybody has a place and everybody needs to do something.
Well, that's certainly true. You know, it's hard sometimes to be optimistic. I've tried to present an optimistic response to the climate problems. But you know, after this last election, when I learned that 74 million of my fellow Americans voted for this proven, demonstrated racist, misogynist, totally incompetent ignoramus, that they voted for him, that really, I lost a lot of respect for my fellow citizens. I'm sorry to say, at my age, you know, I felt pretty good about my country. But after that, I think that we've got almost half, 40% ignorant bigots as American citizens. And that really bothers me. That really bothers me. There are a lot of things to work on there, Bruce.
Yeah, you got that right too.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Bruce.
Politics is important.
Oh, George Stone talking politics? What's it? Dennis, you're next.
George, you mentioned trying to deal with climate change and also stopping cutting down the forest. But can you mention some other things to help deal with the loss of biodiversity besides those two big things?
Well, it's politics. I mean, we've got to elect. Look at the Wisconsin legislature, taken over in 2010 by the Tea Party, anti-Obama Republicans, and we haven't been able to get anything done at the state level since then. Our renewable energy portfolio standard, which is how much we require the utilities to produce from renewable energy, is still back at 10%. The surrounding states in the upper Midwest, it's 25%. Why haven't we been able to get anything done? Because the rural ignoramus Trumpies control our legislature. And that's true in many states around the country. So politics is extremely important. You can't get anything done without it. I encourage everybody to get involved in politics and progressive issues, because we need to take our state house back and we need to get this country going in the right direction. I think Trump was so bad that he couldn't get reelected.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Dennis. Go ahead, Eugene.
I want to add to what Dennis just brought up about other areas that we're not really looking at. 2 years ago, I brought up the issue of hybrid cars. A hybrid car weighs anywhere from 200 to 500 pounds more than just an internal combustion engine because of the weight of the batteries. That means the tires are wearing faster, uses bigger tires. And we don't know actually the wear and tear of the tires where the residue is going. So about a year and a half ago, I read that there is a study going on how the wear of tires alone are helping to, pollute. I don't know if they've come up with anything, but I just bought a new vehicle, a Seltos. I just went upstate for 2 days. I got 39.2 miles to the gallon on it. Why would I need a hybrid? I don't. The extra cost, all the energy and the materials it takes to build the batteries, everything is contributing to our problem. When we go to fully electric cars, that'll be different. But right now, if you have a hybrid and you have batteries and you still have an internal combustion engine, you're not solving the problem. And I warn people not to buy hybrids. They don't really do what you think they're doing. So thank you.
Thank George.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, we're making a lot of progress. I think the Biden administration is committed to conversion to electric vehicles. General Motors, if I'm not mistaken, announced a couple months ago that by 2035, they would be all electric, no more internal combustion cars. And so we're making progress. And the Biden part of the Green New Deal is to put in, I don't know, a couple 100,000 charging stations across the country and provide the infrastructure for electric cars, electric vehicles, I should say. So we're making progress, and we got to keep pushing, not just like now that we've got vaccinations for the COVID, we don't want to be relax ourselves. We still want to wear the mask and social distance and wash our hands a lot. And so we got to keep after it, keep pushing.
Well, thank you, Eugene. Thank you, George. Dennis, you're probably the last up.
Following on that previous comment, we had a really interesting presentation at 350.org a couple of years ago about somebody talking about electric cars and how that would be such an inflection point, just like a total change, almost like going from horses to automobiles to go from where we are now to electric cars. So that was very encouraging. And also just a quick question for George Martin. Did you say, George, that Gwen Moore has been appointed to the Science Committee?
Yes, I did.
Oh, excellent, because we had worked with her with the Citizens Climate Lobby. I was a delegate to her, so I'm glad to hear that she's on that committee.
That's a recent appointment.
Oh, great.
Yeah, she's also now on the Ways and Means Committee with a lot of power. And you want to help her celebrate? She's having a birthday party this coming Sunday.
Okay. Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, George. And does that complete what we're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up, Dennis? Okay. Are we all good? Tom Siri, last one.
Thank you. Just to let you know, I've got a Chevy Bolt, an all-electric car. It's great. The problem has been, I go up, my sister's up in Green Bay, and the cost of traveling up there and recharging my car is like a quarter of the cost of doing it with gasoline. So it is, I very much like it. My dealer called me about 10 days ago and said they've got a bunch of Chevy Bolts that they're selling for $25,000, which is like $7,000 less than the one I paid for. At a 2020 that they're selling. So if somebody's interested in that, the problem right now though is the charging system. For example, if I go up to Green Bay, I got to at least stay overnight to get the charge back up so that I can drive back down here. There is not a system up there that does what's called a level 3 charge. They got a level 2 charges up there, but not level 3. And that's like filling up that level 3 charge is like filling up your car at a gas station. It takes a little longer, but not much. It takes maybe half hour or 45 minutes. Whereas if I've got to charge it up on the 120, it takes a long time. And so that's some of the stuff that Biden is talking about doing, and that sounds good. But I encourage people that the Chevy Bolt, you look at Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports lists the Chevy Bolt as good as the Tesla, as far as customer satisfaction goes, as good as the Tesla, and about $5,000 to $6,000 less expensive. So I like my Chevy Bolt. It's something I encourage people to take a look at. That's enough.
Thank you, Tom.
For the commercial.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay.
You'll get your royalty check next month. So George Stone, I've asked everybody to unmute, please, if you could. And we especially want to thank our fellow member, our friend, Dr. George Stone, for this wonderful presentation.
Yay!
Yay!
Bravo, bravo.
Yay, bravo, bravo.
Where is he?
Well, we don't need him anymore. Right now, we need Julie Inslow.
Okay, I just want to make a few announcements of things that are coming up. First of all, I want to commend Greg Walter, who has been wants to write our email newsletters and put them together, and he's been doing an incredible job. These newsletters that he sends out on email are filled with links to go to some other sources that have wonderful information, and it's a really excellent resource. At the bottom of the email alerts that he sends out are the links for our website, our 350 website, which has excellent material on climate change there, and the links for the website, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter for our 350 Milwaukee group are all at the bottom of these email newsletters that you get. So check out those resources. I think you'll be really impressed with our website and the other links that are provided. So thanks, Greg, for your excellent work on that. And also, for example, right now on the same email that you got that had the link for tonight's meeting, there's also a petition to sign to stop the Line 3 tar sands pipeline that was in Wisconsin and across into Upper Michigan underneath the Straits of Mackinac. And that's an Enbridge line. Enbridge's reputation seems to get worse and worse as time goes on. And so be sure to sign that petition. And I'm sure there are other, you can look that up on your internet also. If you want to get more involved with that issue, they're starting to have some very serious demonstrations, and the indigenous peoples are really gathering around that as they did for stopping the KXL. So it's a big deal in the Midwest. And then be sure to check out the Climate Hope video on our last email that just came out. It's a link you can, it's a little different angle on some of the things we've been talking about tonight. It's this young man who is a scientist, and he's does these climate videos. And this one is about the recent things that have been developing, including the Biden administration, that is giving him some really serious hope in his life. And it's a good one to watch for another angle on this. And then also every Friday at noon, we are back on the corner of Water in Wisconsin. We'll be continuing through the summer and fall seasons. And we are there in front of the Chase Bank and the Wells Fargo banks, which are two of the largest funders in the world of fossil fuel projects. Actually, Chase Bank is the largest financer of fossil fuel projects in the whole world. So we are out there every Friday noon for it's a stop the banking on climate chaos kind of demonstration. And it's part of the Fridays for Future campaigns that are taking place all over the planet. We are there standing for the planet and for targeting on the banks as the main issue for our demonstration. We have signs. Tom Siri brings the signs and banners, and we need your bodies to hold those signs. So start joining us. And we still have to bundle up a bit down there on water in Wisconsin because it's a very windy corner and it can be a little cooler than it is in your own home. So prepare for that. But please join us. It's a good thing to do, and it's good to join forces in the flesh. You can wear masks, but we have plenty of wind to blow away all that COVID crap. So it's a safe place to be. So is there anybody else that has any announcements of things that are coming up?
And if I might, I want to mention our next meeting that I mentioned earlier. And so when Congressman Moore had called Julie on some other matters they were working on the peace end, and I said I need to talk to Gwen. And so I got the phone afterwards. And I said, Gwen, we'd like to have your staff person who's in charge of climate-related matters give us a national update on Biden's proposed legislation. You know, and she said, that's easy. His name is Robert. He's a good guy. I can't remember his last name. So that'll be the content of our next meeting. And Robert is not only in charge of climate, he's in charge of energy, he's in charge of transportation, and a couple other related fields, which is kind of pretty exciting to get him on the phone and for him to prepare something for us. And I was thanking Congressman Moore, and she says, well, George, I got to be on the call. And politely and politically, I didn't say anything. And I said, well, Gwen, you're pretty busy. She said, not enough. You know what these fools did? They appointed me to the science committee. And she said that with a big laugh. And she said, so I want to give an update on the science committee. I said, great. So that's our agenda for our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight.
I got two more cents to get in here.
Okay.
You know, and just on the thank you, you know, and we've got a large list that we emailed to, and we've had up to 80 people on these calls and in our annual meetings, but in our monthly meetings before the pandemic. But I just want to give a shout out to our steering committee, who meets once or twice a month aside from this in terms of working on our campaign and planning our events. And that's Julie, that's Greg, hey, Chris Meyer, Tom Siri, Dr. George Stone, Charlie, yeah, I skipped over Charlie, and Dan Folkman and myself. Have I missed anybody?
Linda.
And yes, yeah. And Linda. So I just want to get that out there just as a appreciation in terms of the folks who are working behind the scenes. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you, Julie and George.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Stay well. Perhaps you can join us Friday at noon.
There you go.
Thank you.